Thank you, Wendy, and thank you all for coming. Those of you who are having a biorhythm dip around this time, I promise I will drone on for about 40 minutes, and you should be able to catch a few moments of sleep in there. I'm going to take as my motto for this talk this line, "The ancestral spirits are harsh, were they not men?" which comes from the Confucian Odes. In these lines, the worst of miseries is to be forgotten by the ancestors. When we consider archives, we should consider not only how we recall the dead, but how they recall us. In its original application to sensory experience, the word aesthetics dealt with the present. But in archive aesthetics, we confront temporalities that extend backward and forward in times. Times that we experience both as sensory things here, right now, in front of us, and also imaginatively, as emissaries from the past to a future of which we only form one moment. To the extent that the aesthetic is also ethical, as I'm going to argue, it ties us into networks of obligation which extend beyond the present moment into the deep past and the deep future. How does ethical obligation operate across this temporal disjuncture, and especially if, as I will also argue, aesthetics is also always political? How does it relate to the dominant regime that governs time today? And I believe that time in the 21st century is predominantly governed by debt, a subject which I'm afraid most students are all too familiar with. I will argue that we do owe a debt to our forebears for their artifacts and to the earth for the materials they're made of. We owe a duty to those who will follow us. At the same time, as archivists, we share that kind of shame and anxiety that accompanies owing more than we can pay, that characterizes the debt crisis. And I use the word advisedly. It's a crisis that's already lasted for 8 years, which pushes the definition beyond breaking point. Debt as gratitude is a universal of human experience, binding us to each other and to the earth. Debt as a universal economic peonage ejects us emotionally and legally from the social and poisons our relations with nature. Debt ties us to a very specific model of time. What we consume today has to be repaid with interest to the future. The condition of contemporary finance capital is that the future is endlessly deferred so that we continue to pay interest without ever coming to that lonely hour of final reconciliation that never arrives. Today, I want to persuade you that archive ethics and archive aesthetics have a special role to play in revealing an alternative mode of inhabiting time, not taking us back to a Confucian moment of communion with the ancestors, but helping us to consider ourselves as media through which the ancestral archives transmit themselves to a future other than that of perpetual indebtedness. In the first instance, the archive is not an aesthetic category, but an ethical one, in that we owe some obligation to the past and the future to maintain objects in the present. This obligation is either virtuous, this is a kind of mini introduction to ethics, it's either virtuous or virtue ethics, it is right and fitting to recall the dead and to pass on their memory, or it's deontological, we remember and transmit ancestral doings as we would wish ourselves and our own works to be remembered and transmitted. And yet neither virtue ethics, according to which we strive to meet the demands of a specific code, such as the Ten Commandments, which incidentally specifically forbids any graven image and therefore is obviously against the visual archive, nor deontological ethics, Kant's categorical imperative according to which we are logically compelled to pursue the good. Neither seem to me to fit our current circumstances. It's not simply that certain demands, such as the prohibition of images, are worse than redundant, more that an unquestioning approach to obligation and duty cannot fit a critical modernity. The dominant ethical belief of our time, running precisely counter to the concentration of wealth in ever-diminishing numbers of hands, which actually characterizes our time, is utilitarianism, the commitment to the greatest good of the greatest number. Now, this falls prey to four challenges. First, archives are forced to justify their existence in competition with other demands on social resources. Second, this competition reveals that welfare of the majority is code for, and indeed the code underlying, Adam Smith's doctrine of the invisible hand of the market, and as such is integral to the dogma of neoliberalism. Third, at the same time, the term welfare indicates that utilitarianism is a code underlying the statistical management of populations, which we know since Foucault as biopolitics. And most of all, fourthly, utilitarianism assumes that the misery of the few is justified by the comfort of the many. The challenge of utilitarianism has always been that it is a politics masquerading as an ethics. But the use of that challenge is that it makes clear that the ethical challenge itself, such as the ethical obligation to archive, is itself a political one. Today I want to propose against all three models a eudaimonist response. So back to my opening slides, just so you can see how to spell eudaimonist, in case my Greek pronunciation isn't particularly good. So grounded in Aristotle's belief that the pursuit of the good life was the purpose of both ethics and politics, the pursuit of a good life. The Nicomachean ethics work methodically through various goods, pleasure, honor, wealth, to arrive at the philosopher's ideal of the best life, the life of the mind. At the end of the ethics, Aristotle turns towards the next question: what is a good life for a society? The task he takes up in the politics. Ethics moves towards politics if, as I believe we must in the wake of Marx and Freud, we understand that the happiness of individuals is actually dependent on the happiness of others. The polis, from which the word politics derives, was a city-state that excluded from citizenship slaves, women, and to an extent even free men who were obliged to work for a living, and therefore, according to Aristotle, didn't have the leisure to consider or debate a good life. Yet the definition of politics as the administration of the polis depends precisely on these exclusions. The history of political struggle has been at its heart the fight to extend the definition of the polis to include slaves, women, colonized peoples. Today, the exclusion of indigenous peoples, prisoners. I think I have some slides here. There you go. There's the Latin translation and a fragment from the oldest papyrus of the Nicomachean Ethics. So we'll leave it there for a moment. The exclusion of indigenous peoples, prisoners, and for Europe the most pressing political issue, migrants from citizenship, and thus from a claim to the good life, defined the meaning of the state, of human rights, of international relations, and our duties to one another. And I would add, I think, because we are here and at such an interesting moment, Europe, the European Union, has been possibly the most important experiment in changing the definition of the nation state. And I pray to God, or all of my gods, that our benighted politicians in the United Kingdom don't withdraw from it in favour of returning to the closed notion of the state that belongs fundamentally to another historical era. Now, we also exclude from our polity all non-human agents, bar one. Ethicists like Peter Singer seek to extend moral rights to animals. Deep ecologists call us to recognize the rights of habitats, forests, oceans, mountains, rivers, and a very few of them for the unnatural habitats of cities, factories, and machines. In raising the question of exclusions and their histories, Jacques Rancière, Chantal Mouffe, Ernesto Laclau, and Angela Davis, among others, argued that each expansion of citizenship has required an immense remaking of the very idea of a polity, the administration of public affairs, that is to say. Because both exclusion and admission ask fundamental questions about the work of politics, which is to discover and realize the good life for all. To extend the franchise to prisoners and migrants is a deep challenge to the very concept of a nation state, on which our global polity is founded. If we extend the polity to include those other things which we govern, but which we allow no part in governing, environments in the broader sense, in which I would include the factory environment and the information environment, which we also exclude from government, we must ask deeper questions still about what it is to live well. Can we live well while we enslave and destroy our world? Can we live aesthetically while condemning what remains other to ourselves and our administrations to anesthesia? The aesthetic is the heart of a good life. It's the pleasure of the senses and of the mind, the pleasures of integration and integrity. For Eudaimonism, the aesthetic is the ethical life because it is a good life. The reverse is also true. There can be no aesthetic that is not also ethical, and no politics that is not also, no true politics that is not also aesthetic, if it is to be the pursuit of the best way to live for everyone. If ethics is always on its way to politics, since to live well we need the rest of the world to live well too, then politics is always a question of a good life lived aesthetically. But actually existing politics fails, as it does in the era of climate change, an economic crisis that has already lasted for 8 years and is heading into a new crash in East Asia, and the crumbling of cosmopolitan ideals in the face of proxy wars and neo-fascism. If the archive is to serve, it must serve a good life for all, against environmental, economic, ethical, and political collapse. The aesthetic concerns the senses as well as the arts. The senses mediate between the human body, other humans, and our environs. The arts mediate between humans and their environs, and in doing so employ various forms of technology. Aesthetics is then a matter of mediations, which is why the media archive is so central to my considerations here. A matter of mediations through which we perceive and communicate our own happiness or otherwise, and that of the worlds we inhabit, social and technological and natural. Putting the word natural in quotes because of the complexity of the term. Therefore, the ethical political question of the good life, even before we extend it beyond the human, is already a question of mediations and thus aesthetic, and doubly so when the aesthetic is the first mediation through which we become aware of the unhappiness, or otherwise, of excluded and non-human others, the moment at which it ceases to be individual and becomes political. The archive operates in this aesthetico-ethical political zone as a special intersection between human and non-human, included and excluded, as encounters between individuals and politics, and between them and the technological and natural environments. Perhaps the most significant aspect of moving image archives is that archived works come towards us as alien. The senses alien, or at least orphaned. We greet them not as evidence of a lost world, or not only that, but as technical artifacts. Their technicity confronts us. The otherness of the archive film or video comes towards us as a stranger, such that in the encounter we have the uncanny sensation of coming face to face with another being. Whatever else we see the technical qualities of the thing. Its substrate, its acquired damage, the edge lettering, the time code. This object presents itself as fragile. We've come to realize that not only old nitrate stock like this, but 5-inch floppies and the drives to run them on, old Trinitrons and their aging color responses, old operating systems we need to run old artist CD-ROMs are falling apart. The newest media are more fragile than the oldest. If you want to save something, carve it in stone. Printed in a book is pretty safe. I was talking to Avi Ray Smith a couple of years ago. He tells me the story is true. They printed the code for Toy Story 1 onto 35mm film. The newest media are more fragile, the oldest are still immensely vulnerable to accident and willful damage. Even to store them requires energy, commitment, and money. Thus they stand before us in need. In Emmanuel Levinas's account of ethics as first philosophy, cited on Aristotle's bridge between ethics and politics, friendship, the encounter of human individuals is always already ethical. When I face the other places a demand on me for recognition. In Simon Critchley's reworking of the thesis, this is an infinite demand. I am obliged beyond reason to the other. Something of this alterity drives the archival encounter. What I encounter is other than myself, yet it has a life, an existence, a presence of its own which I feel bound to acknowledge. This is why so many of us feel such deep revulsion at acts of iconoclasm, book burnings, the willful desecration of antiquities for the global trade in artifacts for the obscenely wealthy, or extraction industries destroying natural beauty. What confronts us is not just what is represented, but the mediation, which is far more physically present in archival material than in the ordinary media that we tend to see through. Even more than the most formally self-reflexive works, archival encounters bring us face to face with fragile but living entities who carry freights both of the intentions of their makers and of the accidents that have occurred to them in their journeys through time. The archival thing is more than its freight of human motivations and symbols, more even than the contingent asignifying elements gathered at the time of its making. It is itself a palimpsest of chemical and physical processes that have occurred subsequently down the long years between making and the meeting in the archive. The things we encounter in this sense are wholly technological. So what is technology? And I am going to avoid Heidegger. You'll be glad to know. In the pages of the Grundrisse devoted to machines, Marx gives the beginnings of what I believe is an ethical answer. Factory technologies, he argues, are the congealed form of human skills, gestures, and tricks of the trade, concretized in the actions of machines devoted to weaving, sewing, knitting, extruding metals, burnishing steel. A given technology is an assemblage of elements from cogs to chips, lenses to casings, each of which is made in turn from techniques developed as handcraft in some distant past, means of bringing devices into series from more recent proto-mechanical devices, ways of organizing and doing that have been ossified and placed over against the factory worker as a system from which she is alienated, yet which she must serve as a disciplined operator. Now, in Marx, this is a massive theft of skill turned against the very workers from whom they have been taken in capital's relentless transformation of specific work into abstract labor. What we should take from Marx's definition, and this I owe to Maori friends in New Zealand, is that technological black boxes are the coffins in which we in the West keep our ancestors. In traditional societies, each skill is associated with an ancestor and the ancestors are revoked whenever that skill is deployed. But we have anonymized ours. We've locked them into servitude and set them as devices to control the living. Archival objects belong to this logic. When we encounter one, when we encounter it as technical, we confront the alienation of the dead. This is why the confrontation is so profoundly affecting and why it draws from us the respect and responsibility the archivist feels towards her charges. The commitment to the good life is unfounded if it does not include a commitment to the life of these artifacts, these ancestors. So, archives extend ethics beyond the interpersonal humanistic plane. While everyone involved in archival work has to speak to the utilitarian ethic because that's how we raise funds, there's a more particular ethos involved in the archival confrontation. In Levinas's face-to-face encounter in which the ethical situation situates the ethical subject as perpetually obligated to the other, A paramount quality of that other is its complete specificity. For Levinas, only the encounter with another human counts, and not, for example, a film version or a televised appearance, so that we only meet the other as a member of our species, a finally unknowable other who nonetheless shares with us a here and a now. The archival encounter, like the encounter with the recorded or broadcast image, is different in that the simultaneity and co-location are not guaranteed, and we do not meet our likeness in a member of our own species, but something other, ghostly, of another time and place. But there are similarities with Levinas' encounter. The other is not a member of a taxonomic class or type, but particular and distinct. This too is the case with the archival object. Though we see a film or video as nitrate or safety stock, as U-matic, half-inch reel-to-reel, 5-inch floppy, we also confront it as something that has had its own unique trajectory through time, acquiring its electrical and chemical scars, abraded and marked by the patina of age. Each archival object presents itself alone. This demand that it places is the demand of an irreplaceable. Even if we're looking at duplicates, as Paulo Kerke asserts, there are no identical copies in the archive. In this, disputing the tenet of Benjamin that replication marks the mechanical media. It also gets rid of Baudrillard's concept of the copy without an original, because every copy is unique. And the popular belief that digital copies are all identical and that nothing is lost in copying, which I'm sure by now all of us have realized is far from true. The archival ethic, then, is to save this specific copy. But that then places us in a dilemma. Not only is there the brute constraint that we can't preserve everything, there is too the question of what it is that we're trying to preserve. The traditional goal of the archivist, the film archivist in particular, was to restore the object as near as possible to its original state. And the cleaning of Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne here for the National Gallery represents an apogee of this impulse. And the controversy over Daniel Goldreyer's restoration of Barnett Newman's Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow and Blue 3 is perhaps its nadir. You may remember the huge controversy at the Stedelijk about this restoration after it was attacked by a slightly demented schoolteacher. Though, frankly, given the current rates of pay and social pressures on schoolteachers, who can blame him? Increasingly faced with the constraints of storage costs, archivists are faced not only with the damnable choice between items to be taken on for full restoration, while marking others down to the tender mercies of storage in the full knowledge that they will continue to decay, but with the choice of what it is they're trying to preserve. The question of canon formation and the balance between, which Lev raised in his video talk, and the balance between preservation and access, to which Caroline Flick has recently devoted such deft historical scholarship in a book on the politics of the archive, which I thoroughly recommend. The rival claims are impossible to balance. Frick argues that in her case, the film industry has had the lion's share of preservation and access, while equally historically valuable industrial films, instructionals, and amateur movies have not. Within those parameters, there's been a tendency, for example, to sideline women's work, province where sidelining is effectively a death sentence. As Jane Gaines notes in the case of a cache of Lois Weber silent films left aside to moulder until they were no longer recoverable in the UCLA archive. Many colonial films, African-American films, and other marginalized practices have suffered equally. These content-oriented questionings of the politics of archiving and the politics of heritage as it operates to found and legitimate contemporary cultural regimes suggest that the work of the archive is as much one of systematic forgetting as it is of remembrance. Now, as Michael Punt phrases it, the question is whether we seek to save the software or the hardware. Either way, he writes, it is the films, that is the software of cinema, that are considered to be the primary trace of human consciousness. What is excluded from this kind of history, he continues, is the popular and individual imagination that is sustained by technology as hardware, and the act of engaging with technology collectively and individually as an extension of consciousness. Thinking through the exhibition of Émile Reynaud's projecting praxinoscope Théâtre Optique at the Musée Grévin, Punt argues that both animation and an anti-naturalistic and anti-scientific popular fascination with spiritualism and the unreal was as deep a driver of the origination of cinema as the realist narratives which became the norms of the archive. In the same analysis, he suggests that what was so fascinating was not the iconography, but the technology of animation itself, with all its Frankensteinian inheritance. To extend Punt's arguments, the technologies that animated the inanimate reversed the historical process outlined by Marx, in which the animated gestures of workers became inanimate machines. The foregrounding of the technical substrate, in which the substrate is no longer subordinate in archival work, is one way of honouring both the anonymous dead and the now lost cultural event of the cinematic as a communication with another and non-human life. To the extent that the ethical is that aspect of humanity that first orients us towards others, it's already social and already political. This ethical-political relationship, however, is not immediate. It is conducted through the senses, by envisaging the face of the other in sight, sound, touch, and increasingly, since the inventions of photography, sound recording, and telephony, by technological media. Like all human socialization, ethical relations are mediated, whether by voice, gesture, clothing, situation, environment, or the more abstract channels of connection we experience through money and trade. If we speak of power, we must speak of that capillary action, Foucault notes, by which it is communicated through verbal orders, written laws, or the short end of a baton. The aesthetic in which ethics are thus embroiled is always mediated, to the extent that moving images mediate so radically and directly depicted human and non-human actors, and at the same time mediate through the agency of a third non-human process. They're already engaged in an ethical and political process. So I take Michael Punt's argument for attention to the hardware as pointing towards a commitment to the mediating process and engagement with ancestral presences locked in our devices. So while media archaeologists like Erkki Huhtamoo and Thomas Elsesser have powerful cases that we should not approach past devices teleologically, it's also the case that the normative apparatus of the present, to the extent that it is one apparatus, is built from the elements contrived out of us ancestral labor over a period of centuries, to the extent that we need a genealogy alongside our archaeology. In this stereoscopic view of media history, the particularities of features like the succession of frames and the operation of scanning have lineages denoting not just the work of famed inventors, but the lost work of those who first developed techniques for regulating action through clockwork and vibrations, or whose embroidery and weaving created the terms for constituting images out of points of colour. Archive ethics always demands a responsibility to the dead, but it also includes a responsibility to those anonymous deceased whose labour inhabits and operates in our machinery, our own machinery, including the digital technologies we use to preserve such things as old movies. By the same token, we owe a debt to the materials from which those devices have been built. The science of ecology operates on a simple premise of connections. Humans are part of the planet. The same might be asserted of our relations with technology, not as determinants in McLuhan's sense, but in the cyborg model of Donna Haraway. Our lives are inextricably technological as well as biological, a case even more true of the dead in their technological permanence. The materials that media have been made from and that persist in archives as concentrations of metals and plastics have their histories too. Histories that weave together the long disaster of silver mining, oil extraction, mining across centuries and continents, often deeply involved in histories of colonialism and genocide, and histories of the energy derived from fossil fuels, hydroelectricity from dammed rivers and flooded valleys, and the nuclear power with its history of weaponized byproducts, devastated indigenous communities and waste. The deep time of the media, which Jussi Parikka has extended to embrace geological times of media, is also the inheritance of the archive, and a responsibility which does not end simply because the materials have already long been dug, refined, concentrated, and shipped to metropolitan centers of wealth, power, and culture. The human history of exploitation is not lost by the transfiguration of metals into films and hard drives, or of oil into celluloid and videotape. Nor is the degradation of the planet healed by the cultural transformation of its resources into artifacts. On the contrary, we owe to that history an immense debt which we can repay only by respecting the materials that we do hold. There is a certain shame involved in these precious artifacts, but even more if we fail to respect the artifacts themselves for the generosity, even if it was enforced, of the earth that gave them physical form. And a certain melancholy, which adds itself to the archivist's melancholic understanding that not everything can be saved. This melancholia should not, however, be paralyzing. It should be a sense we all share, as Benjamin suggested almost a century ago, that we are the posterity to whom past generations looked to be the ones who judged them. We have that great burden and that duty, from carrying out which alone we can free ourselves. Oh, I've missed my good slide here. Oh, never mind. From carrying out which alone we can free ourselves to the good life that is our task. So long ago, Michelangelo wrote of the statue that waited in the stone to be revealed. In the archive, we should recognize the stone that was sacrificed to make the statues. And precisely because we cannot repair it or return it to its native place, all the more should we be conscious of how hard it is to repay that debt and how heavily our responsibilities lie upon our shoulders. If on the one hand we have to argue the value of archives to the present and future, we also undertake the work in full recognition of a duty owed to the past. The pastness of archived materials is legible in their fragility. It is easy to see how pastness and fragility are aesthetic qualities. Their ethical value, in the expanded sense endorsed here, is to lay on us who are living the task of justifying to the dead and to those agents in the planet, from geology to plants, the sacrifices they have made to provide us with meaning and beauty, and with the very ethical challenge which we take up, and which challenge we also owe to them. Working on the Rewind archive of video art, we're constantly reminded of this fragility. And I'll just play a scrappy poo of this whilst I'm speaking. Among them is the question of what it is we're capable of preserving. From those pioneers only 40 years ago who first deployed analog video to record their communities in struggle and their art. A brief glimpse of Viaggio in Luca Patella gives a sense of the weight of this question. A performance artist before he took up a camcorder, Patella's tape is structured by glitches, those horizontal crashes in the scan that result from combinations of interrupted signals, as when the camera was turned off and on or edited. Time wears down the polyester tape, loosens the oxide particles from their bind with it, and disperses the magnetism whose orientation carries the signal. There's little by way of technique that could reconstitute the tape as it was in 1976. One quality of analog video was that with each generation, the signal-to-noise ratio increased far more than film dupes before or digital dupes after it. Running off a last copy, as archivist Adam Lockhart has done in this case, involves carefully heating the tape in a kiln, in an oven. It's a very frightening project. Just enough to bond the oxides back to the tape without buckling the plastic, to allow the tape to run one last time through a reconstituted reel-to-reel deck so that the analog signal can be digitized and saved to digibeta, the archive medium of choice at the moment, though we know we will have to transfer onward within a decade. We preserve what we can. So I'll just close Luca here. Stop. And come back to this. We know from Patella that the glitches were, in his mind, integral to the tape as he wished it to be seen, but we cannot ascertain which of the glitches were intended, which have migrated along the tape during editing, and which are artifacts of storage, because tape's very vulnerable to things like electric mains, and if you don't move the tape often enough, an electric mains supply will burn a hole in it, in the magnetics. What we have preserved is its state of decay. It's not simply that this is the best that can be managed, as is the case with a number of restorations. So I'll just pop this one up and play it whilst I speak, because it is exceptionally beautiful. So, for example, the Australian National Archives 2007 reconstruction of the 1906 story of the Kelly Gang, the physical decay presents a new collaboration between machines and natural processes which produce a new work, apart from the work as it would have looked at its first exhibition, which, if only in imagination or memory, were once envisaged as the goal of restoration. This new encounter is no longer with a pristine and immutable past, but with a deeply mutable and mutating experience, as it were an inhuman improvisation on a theme first laid down 40 or 100 years ago. The still photographs, this is an argument that a New Zealand photographer, Chris Orchard, makes. Still photographs are traumatically ripped from the continuum of time. The moving image, I would add, was invented as a way of healing that trauma, but can only do so on the principle that each frame is itself radically incomplete, necessitating the next image, and the next, and the next, and the next. In this sense, moving image media offer an alternative model of movement through time to that of accumulating debt. Under financialization, debt spends today the earnings of the future, mortgaging our future production in the form of future wages that we're pledged to give the banks as soon as they're earned. So not only committing us to keep earning, but to maintain the wage relation in perpetuity, and so to close down the possibility of any alternative, any concept of the future as open possibility. In moving images, we commit instead to the unexpected, precisely because in each single frame, we ineluctably miss the completion of flux in the present. In the archive of moving images, the apparent containment of past time in recordings is broken by the unavoidable interactions of the ostensibly completed artifact with the vagaries of human, technical, and natural action. In its very decay, the archive video demonstrates the morbidity, not of ephemerality, but of permanence. It's permanence that is actually the disease, where permanence has become the permanence of finance. Final paragraph. When I speak of melancholia then, I'm not speaking of nostalgia, but of what Freud referred to as a failure to mourn successfully, where success was measured by the ability to return the ego to its normal round of duties, including its duty to perpetual repayment of debt. The archivist embrace of melancholy, failed mourning, begins in the moving image's impetus to complete the rift in the real instigated by the still image, and inhabits the archive's impulse to return to origin while knowing it is impossible. What remains is to recognize the fact, subjective and objective, of torn time, to encounter the infinitely demanding other of decay, and to transform that inevitability into a talismanic promise that the future will not be an unending duplication of the past. Patella's Viaggio like the story of the Kelly gang, already entered the world as ephemeral. Its ephemerality has been checked for a while. We carry it forward for a while. We can no more fix it than we can bring back Columbus or absolve Hiroshima. We conduct politics on that same basis. The aesthetics of archiving derive from this duty to the past, to the planet, and to the nameless dead, our impossible task of bearing their truth to those for whom we in turn will also be ancestors. It is a melancholy science, but the only way for a melancholy eudaimonist condemned to mourn the anaesthetic contemporary politics that excludes the good life and obliged for whatever good we have or hope for to the generosity of what has passed and is to come. Thanks for your patience.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sean. Let's see. Let's let that sink in for a moment and get some questions from the audience.
The question is less, are there any questions? Is anyone still awake?
No.
Wait, Oliver then.
We have a taker. Yes. Up there. You just. Can you raise your hand again so that we can get a microphone to you?
Hello. Hello. So, after all the speech and the poetic speech, I would like to ask what is the practical rule of the melancholia archivist function? Like,
Yes, absolutely. Brilliant question. We're the question, I think, concerns what it is possible to keep. Lev suggests a kind of democratic, possibly social graphing mode of selection, as opposed to, implicitly, I suppose, Christiana's model of the expert curator and the generous but constrained institutions that are involved. I think what I'm concerned with is how we, or what it is that we can retain and carry forward. So in the case of the archive work that I've been involved with through the Rewind projects in particular, this has been with analog video. It's an extraordinarily delicate medium, even though it's, for the most part, the things we're looking at are between 35 and 45 years old. They are already on, really at the very, very last stages of decay. So my argument is, in part, practically, that we should not attempt to reconstitute the old as if we could attain to an original, but that we actually must capture, in all honesty and as a genuine aesthetic practice, the states of decay in which we confront them. It's a big debate in archives, so I don't feel that I have the authority to say this is the only way to function. It is, however, so your question is really well taken, but it is very strongly my belief that we cannot reconstitute the original experience of even a 100-year-old media artifact, let alone something far older than that.
It is a great question, and I would also argue that one cannot build an archive without having answered all of your questions, ultimately. Another question I have is, whether this changes depending on the subject. The example I mentioned, like the Douglas Davis piece, was precisely about that too. So what version of the past do we preserve? Or what is the past in the first place? Yeah. So do the questions also change on the basis of the objects that we're trying to archive? I mean, not even, coming to your conclusion and saying, oh, we can never preserve the past, but isn't the question what kind of past are we preserving in each and every archive, depending on what it is trying to archive?
Yeah, there is this kind of plurality involved in, or pluralism involved because of the great variety. So from John Ippolito and Rick Reinhardt's work on variable media, there is one sense of what is preservable and what is necessarily lost. A very specific concept, which you illustrated brilliantly earlier on this afternoon. There are many others. So one of them, which I think is particularly useful for some of the people here today, is that art critics are very guilty of never giving a physical description of the experience of an artwork. We almost never actually say, it was yay big, it was this bright, it was bright enough to read a book by, or we don't say those things, and therefore future generations have no idea how to reconstitute an installation or a piece of work. How slow were those touch screens on Graham Weinbrand's Earl King? Just how slow exactly? Because we don't describe those physical attributes and leap straight towards writing about concepts. That's something of which I'm as guilty as anybody else, but it is a great failing. So part of the order of our, since we are the only human beings in the history of the world who are actually alive, we are the only ones who can actually undertake this job. So giving a really great description is an absolutely integral part of this. So there are many plural ways of developing this ethical approach, and I wouldn't want to preclude any of them. But there are certain moments when you see a recreated silent movie, where it's excellent. I teach film, I love old film. The better the reconstitution, absolutely wonderful. But then you hear it with one of those 70-piece orchestras attempting to reconstitute the experience of 1922, and you think, give me something contemporary. Incidentally, I was thinking in terms of music, isn't it curious that modernist music, all the other arts, literature, painting, etc., we took to our hearts, James Joyce and Picasso and everybody are wonderful, and nobody likes Schoenberg. However, when it comes to digital art, nobody likes digital art, but the musos love digital music. Something has flipped in the middle of the age of the 20th century. So that should be a lesson to me, not to be too certain of what I'm saying.
It's dangerous to say nobody loves Schoenberg in Vienna, especially.
Xenakis. Yes. Very true.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I found particularly interesting when you referred to technology basically having a history in itself, and it's basically, you said the coffins of our ancestors, these black boxes. Now, you also had a kind of ecological take on some of the things, so I was just thinking by myself to kind of rephrase Timothy Morton's book title, Ecology Without Nature, where he's referring to the romantic idea of nature. Would there be preservation without an archive? Is archive a romantic idea?
Oh, interesting thought. This also is hotly debated, and I'm sure you know, with Foucault, Derrida, and a wonderful book by Cornelia Fissmann, the English title, which was Files. There's been a great deal of discussion about the archive as an operation of power, essentially. And I think to my mind, they are describing a particular mode of archive, that they're talking about the governmental archive rather than the cultural archive. And they also, I think, Fissman is an exception here, but they talk as if it functions efficiently. And that, of course, all of us who've worked with archives know is not the case, and cannot be. The archive is by no means efficient. So it raises the huge question. You're quite right about the notion of nature. I used it very easily today because life's too short to argue every word in the dictionary, but it's absolutely the case. The word technology has a similar kind of history, as well as an entity like the hinges on my glasses case have a history. It's also the case that the term technology has a very changing history. Now, in response to Morton, one of my arguments is that the concept of nature that we have is constructed by a process of environmentalization, that in a particular historical movement that begins with the enclosure of common land in Europe and then is extended to the long period of primitive accumulation through colonization, seizure of land and the exclusion of people from large tracts of it is the way that nature becomes alien to us. It becomes a stranger instead of being something that was common. Similarly, technology. At a certain point, the Heideggerian description of the hammer and the jug is accurate, but we have come to a point in which technologies are alien to us. They've been environmentalized. I believe that at the moment the same is true of information, that information has become an environment. So if I'm lost in Vienna, I'd rather trust Google Maps than somebody I asked on the street, because there is an environment that knows. Now, in the same way, I think we've externalized the archive. We have placed it as an over there, as an externality. And that, I think, is part of our problem, because in a certain sense, if to be human is to mediate, then we are also archives. And we are part of that process. However, we externalize that process increasingly, perhaps, in artifacts like Facebook. There's nothing worse than Facebook telling you what you were doing last year. So we are actually trusting external agencies far more with our pasts. And there, I think, it's an abnegation of a common responsibility. I've spoken today about we archivists, as it were, people who are professionals, but there is also the sense in which any one of us is an archive transmitting from past to future. And there, I think, we have to reconstitute the concept again after a kind of post-structural moment and rethink it one more time in the light of re-envisioning what we mean by technology and nature. Does that respond to you?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. If we can have just one quick last question, and then after that we'll save questions for the discussion with all of the speakers afterwards. So just one, yeah.
So I have one question, which is, why do you think things should be archived? By this, I don't mean that we don't have to archive things, but rather, how come some things need to be archived and some of them just archive them by themselves somehow?
Really intriguing question. I think certain things look after themselves you're quite right. Certain things archive themselves in a very damaging way. The Rio Doce Dam, which recently burst in Minas Gerais in Brazil and tipped huge quantities of tailings from an iron mine down the Rio Doce, and it is a huge environmental disaster, immense disaster. The mine has not actually worked since 1936. The iron that came from it may quite feasibly be recycled into my glasses case. I do not know. It is self-archiving. Was it Colorado, I think, where they had the gold mine disaster a few months ago? I don't know whether my ring has gold from that mine. It may very well. That it archives itself in a dangerous and frightening way. Yeah, of cultural artifacts. Yeah, yeah.
You would have, I don't know, for example, Citizen Kane by Orson Welles. It somehow archived itself by propagation in such a way that it doesn't need to be archived anymore, in a way. So then, we archive objects that, well, let's say the mainstream doesn't care about then?
I mean, there are equal and opposite examples. So in the case of Erich von Stroheim's Greed, the 22-reel version was cut down to 8 reels for release, and the remainder were pulped in order to take the silver back to make new film stock. So there's a case of a film that, despite being one of the landmarks in film history, it exists now in only a damaged case. The same is true of the rules of the game, la règle du jeu. We only have a truncated version. So it's a very peculiar balancing act between those things which we know we want to... It's one of those things like Donald Rumsfeld spoke about, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. There are things we know that we want to preserve, and there are things that we don't know we want to preserve, but we sort of do. But then there are, of course, the unknown artifacts that we suddenly rediscover. In the case of this film, for example, the last fragments were found in somebody's suitcase in an attic about 1997. Just because the previous reel that was also there had caught fire spontaneously. Yeah, it's luck and bad luck. Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Sean, and we'll have an opportunity for more questions in a bit.
And the one who has organized this conference. He's chair professor of image science at Danube University, where he developed new international programs such as media art histories, image science, and the Erasmus Mundus joint master degree program. Oliver Grau's research focuses on the history and theory of media art, immersion and emotions, as well as the culture of telepresence and artificial life. He also supports digital humanities, for instance, with the innovative archive of digital art and the online presentation of the graphic collection of Göttwerk Abbey. His many publications were translated in 14 languages. His book, Virtual Art, is the internationally most quoted publication of contemporary art history. Recently, Oliver Grau was elected as a member of the Academia Europaea, and his presentation today is entitled On a Political Iconography of Digital Arts, its Archive and a Museum Infrastructure for the 21st Century.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and I hope I can add to these fantastic 3 different perspectives we already saw and we already were witnessing in the last in the course of this afternoon. And I will go more a little bit to archives, to digital archives itself, and will, like Christiane, add to this question where what can we do with the digital arts of our time. So over the last 50 years, media art or digital art, I will speak on media art here, has evolved into a vivid contemporary factor. Although there are well-attended festivals worldwide, collaborative projects, discussion forums, and database documentation, media art is still too rarely collected by museums, as we know, barely supported within the mainframe of art history, and with relatively low accessibility for public and scholars. Compared to traditional art forms, painting or sculpture, digital media art has a multifarious and complex potential of expression and visualization, and therefore, although underrepresented at the art market, which follows other interests, as we know, it became, we might say, the art of our time, in parentheses, thematizing complex challenges for our life and societies like genetic engineering and post-human bodies, globalization and ecological crises, the image and media revolution, the virtualization of finance markets, and new extremes of surveillance of human communication, just to name a few theme clusters my team empirically identified at the most important media art festivals of the last decade. So visually, powerful interactive media art, perhaps supported by databases or attached to the World Wide Web, is offering more and more degrees of freedom and evidently is much better equipped to deal with the challenges of our complex time than traditional art media can. So far, not museums, but festivals can be considered as the most important media for current developments regarding issues, technologies, and discourses on digital art. Although the biennial project at the ZKM revealed that digital artworks play a part at more than 200 biennials worldwide, and the systematic investigation of digital art festivals themes within the ATMA, so our project at Danube University, which we also can see outside the archive of digital art as a part of it,